So we've just finished talking about fertilization. What happens after fertilization? Well, there are two different things that we need to talk about. One thing we'll talk about is a little bit about development, but just a little bit. But the other thing that it's important for you to know is that when there has been fertilization, this guy here, the ovary, we need to make sure that this structure, the corpus luteum, keeps making progesterone, right? The progesterone from the corpus luteum is what will maintain the pregnancy in the initial period. I can't remember, it's after a month or after 2 months, the fetus will take over production of the hormones. But for right now, we need that corpus luteum to stay in place. This little guy, once it does something called implanting, and we'll talk about that, it will start to make a hormone called HCG. You need to know it's on the exam. HCG is the hormone that is made by the successful pregnancy, and that hormone will tell the ovary, hey, we got pregnant this time. And then the ovary will keep the corpus luteum going, and then there will be progesterone that keeps being made, right? Oops, where are you? Okay. But we got a successful fertilization because ovulation and ejaculation and capacitation all coincided just perfectly. Terrific. Now that we've got a fertilized egg, let's talk about what happens next. First of all, there's something unexpected. At least it was unexpected to me. I was just visiting a friend's lab, and she's got a new postdoc in her lab that is doing research on exactly what we're looking at here. All of the steps between fertilization and what is known as implantation in humans. And there are a number of things that can go wrong in this process. She's not studying those. But even if you get a successful, it's almost an embryo at this point, down to the uterus, only about 30% of them will do this thing called implanting. And that's really distressing. When it comes to fertilized eggs in humans, it is estimated that less than 25% of the fertilized eggs will end up becoming a pregnancy that can be recognized by the woman and, identified in a pregnancy test. That's crazy that 3 out of every 4 pregnancies never end up being a pregnancy, essentially. The woman never even knows that there was a fertilization event. But the other thing we're looking at is here. This period of time from here all the way down to there is going to take about a week. And over that period of time, if the fertilization has created a successful little living creature, then they will be dividing and dividing and dividing. Now, you would imagine that with that many cells at the end of this week, that this is quite large. You would be wrong. During this first week of being a fertilized egg, it's now a zygote, these cells are dividing so quickly, there's no time for growth at all. So this little guy is pretty much the same size as the original egg was, which is surprising, right? But that doesn't mean it's the same thing. So this little guy is now a hollow ball of cells, and that is called a blastocyst. And its job is to implant into the uterine wall. So we need to know about implantation. Implantation, it takes about a week for the fertilized zygote to make it to the uterus, and then it implants. How does it implant? It's going to arrive, and then it actually uses digestive enzymes to digest its way into the outer part of the endometrium, and it creates a little tunnel, and then it ends up being completely covered by the endometrium originally, right? So here it is, it's one cell, then two cells, then four cells, then eight cells, right? It gets more and more cells, but it doesn't get a lot bigger because there's no time for growth in between. Now, I've got something circled here in purple that is going to be the kind of embryo that gets stored when people have in vitro fertilization. You've probably heard of in vitro fertilization. When people have trouble with getting pregnant on their own, then they'll go to the doctor and the doctor will take out eggs, borrow some sperm, well, they're not going to give it back, and put them together in the laboratory. Back when it was first developed, they called them test tube babies, and people were very distressed. But what they will do is in that little petri dish, I don't know if it's a petri dish, but they will watch all of these stages of development to make sure that they don't just have a fertilized egg, but that they've got a fertilized egg that's got a chance at being a successful pregnancy. And when it gets to around this stage, they consider it an embryo, and most of them will be frozen for the couple. And then depending on the age of the mother, they will implant, 3 or so, sometimes fewer, embryos into the mother's uterus, right? So these are the embryos. Now, what are embryonic stem cells? People argue about embryonic stem cells. People will protest embryonic stem cells, but I think not that many people know what embryonic stem cells are. Embryonic stem cells are these cells right in here. Okay, so these cells, I'm drawing right along them. Those cells around the outside, those are not embryonic stem cells. Those cells have already decided what they want to be when they grow up. And all of those cells have decided, I'm going to be part of the placenta. The placenta is an organ that is only there in a woman and only while she's pregnant. We'll talk a little bit about it. But the cells around the outside, they've already decided what they want to be when they grow up. Now, these cells in here, and there are a lot of them, okay? There's like maybe 100 or so. Those are all embryonic stem cells. And even one embryonic stem cells, boom, theoretically is capable of making an entire human being. These cells here are called embryonic stem cells, and any individual embryonic stem cell can be anything. We talked about bone marrow, right? Bone marrow's got stem cells, but those stem cells, they can't be anything. They could be a heart muscle cell, they can be a blood vessel cell, they can be a red blood cell, a white blood cell, a platelet, but they couldn't be a bone. They couldn't be a liver. They couldn't be a brain, right? These guys in here, they could be an entire person. So the first thing is embryonic stem cells. When people have in vitro fertilization, it is very common that they will, once they have a pregnancy or maybe 2 pregnancies, then any embryos that remain, they will not be used anymore. They can be donated to other parents or they can be discarded. Rather than discarding them, scientists like to use the embryonic stem cells, and that's where all the hubbub starts. One more thing about embryonic stem cells. I told you how fraternal twins happen, right? An egg from each ovary. They're different genetically, which is why you've got twins that are just fraternal twins. They're not identical twins. But I told you I was going to tell you identical twins happen. Identical twins happen when something divides up this particular group of embryonic stem cells. So I don't think they even know why it happens. But if we were to just artificially put like a little divider in the middle of those embryonic stem cells, then what would happen is we would end up forming 2 entirely separate but identical twins. So now you know where both types of twins come from. Okie dokie. Embryonic stem cells. So in this particular image, we see the blastocyst. That's where embryonic stem cells come from. The ones out here that are purple, those ones that are purple, they, yeah, they have already decided what they want to be when they grow up. They're going to be part of the placenta. The ones that they've got depicted here in gold, those are the embryonic stem cells. There's a name for it otherwise. And theoretically, we could take all of these guys out except for one, and we would still get a perfect little tiny human, right? So this is going to be our blastocyst. This is almost an embryo, practically an embryo, and it is going to tunnel in. And that tunneling in, you need to know, is called implantation. I'll write it because that's one of the terms that you need to know for your exam. Implantation. Implantation, okay? Now, this little thing doesn't look like much. Like I said, if I had it in a petri dish in front of you, you could barely even identify it as being there. That's how tiny it is. But it is actually rather powerful. The first thing it's going to do is make human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. You need to know that for the exam, HCG. HCG is the, let's see, what is the study guide question on this? Study guide question. I don't think this is a complete study guide, but HCG is the hormone that the embryo makes that will tell the corpus luteum that's over there in the ovary, don't go away, stick around, because this time we actually got pregnant. Good, HCG. And HCG is what is tested for in pregnancy tests. So whenever you have a pregnancy test or do a pregnancy test, what are you detecting? HCG. Where does it come from? It comes from the embryo. So a couple other terms, gestation and parturition. Gestation and parturition. Gestation is the medical term for pregnancy. It is that interval time that a woman is carrying the developing offspring. Starts out as an embryo, becomes a fetus after a little while. Yeah, you don't need to know the day. Now, gestation is about 266 days in humans. However, we generally predict birth to be 280 days from the last menstruation. And now you know why. Because gestation is from pretty much within 24 hours of ovulation until the day a woman gives birth. And that day of ovulation was about 2 weeks after the first day of her last menstruation. So now you know why there's a difference between the gestation period and when we medically predict it. And it's because of that 2-week interval between something we could identify, which is the first day of the last period, and what we don't know exactly when it happened, the day of ovulation. And that period of pregnancy is divided up into 3-month intervals that get called trimesters. I don't actually know how someone decided to do that. However, it ends up being medically relevant. Specifically, the first trimester is by far the most dangerous interval of time for the pregnancy. There is still a significant chance of what we term a miscarriage or loss of a pregnancy in that first trimester. That's why a lot of people, even though they know they're pregnant, they don't share it with the family until after the first trimester, just because miscarriages are hard enough without having to make them public. So we will start there at the beginning of our next video.